You're listening to this week's Shoutout, Jewish stories of faith from doubters to doctors to the devoutly Orthodox. This is Moishe Rosen's story, as read by Tuvia Zaretsky.
I wasn't looking for Jesus or God or anything ontological. I kept my nose to the grindstone. My goal in life was nothing big. I just wanted to earn a good living and be able to afford a middle-class lifestyle. But even if I wasn't looking for Jesus, he was looking for me. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, in a neighborhood where most of the people were Jewish. If you walked into a grocery store, or the shoemaker, or the barber, you expected to hear Yiddish. Most people who followed the Jewish religion had few choices. Most of us were Orthodox. There was one conservative congregation and one Reform temple, but those were for upper-class people. So Orthodox was the way most of us went, even though we didn't particularly follow doctrines, and we didn't particularly work at being observant. It was a rare thing for any Jewish family to move to Denver or to move from Denver. The neighborhood was unchanged. So when Celia Starr moved into my block, and she'd come all the way from Boston, there was a lot of curiosity about this immigrant. That's what we called people who came from other cities. I worked out a strategy. I made friends with her mother, and sure enough, I got to talk to Seal. I didn't make fun of her accent, and she didn't remind me of my reputation as being a roughneck. We were sweethearts in high school. She had a better knowledge of the Jewish religion than I did. Her parents were from, or strictly observant. But when it came time for us to be married, we were married in an Orthodox synagogue. By then, I was an agnostic, and she was a self-proclaimed atheist. God just didn't have a place in our lives. Prayer meant talking to yourself, and miracles were like magic fairy tales. But it didn't stay that way for long. When Seal was pregnant with our first child, she began to wonder about God. She realized that much of her atheism had been a reaction to her upbringing. She knew there had to be more out there. Seal had been impressed by singing Christmas carols in high school, particularly the one, O Come, Emmanuel, that bore the line, and ransom captive Israel. She thought, what did Jesus have to do with Israel? And why did Israel need to be ransomed? As Seal puzzled on these things, she fell back into a habit of her childhood. She prayed. She'd stopped praying when she was 5 years old, but now she was asking God if he would show himself to her. No one who ever earnestly prayed that prayer has failed to see the Almighty answer it. She had a sudden urge to read the New Testament, a book which is scorned by Jews as being Goyish and not for our people. So quietly she began to read it, and Seal discovered that the New Testament was a surprisingly Jewish book involving Jewish people, but most of all, it was about the Jewish Messiah. But she couldn't put it all together. She prayed again, that God would help her understand it. And help was on the way, in the form of a missionary from the American Board of Missions to the Jews. Now, I had heard the gospel earlier. I was just 17 years old, and someone on a street corner started talking to me. He got started in on the gospel, and then he told me something very strange. Now, realize this was 1947. He said, look for Israel to become a state. Now, I was fascinated by what he said. We had both taken the same bus, and I followed him, walking all the way home with him, and just stood on his front porch for a while, taking all of this in. He went into his house, and he got a New Testament, and he asked me to read it. Well, as I walked home, I started thinking, what he says makes sense. So that means that I must be one dumb Jew, because Jewish people don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And I'm not going to read this book, because if I read it, I might believe it. And I don't trust my own judgment. Nope, I'm not going to have anything to do with this. If the rabbis ever get together and decide that Jesus is the Messiah, maybe I'll go along with them. Then, 4 years later, my wife was groping for the truth to know how to follow Christ. The Lord answered her prayer. It was then that I found out how hostile and angry I could be. But in her newfound faith, she had the patience to endure my anger and my hostility. I thought there was probably a good case that could be made against believing in Jesus, so I visited our rabbi, the one who married us. I asked him for the intellectual ammunition that would convince her. He sat down and made explanations to me that seemed no more than a quibbling about possible variants in the meaning of Hebrew words. I looked at him and I said, Rabbi Bricks, these things will not convince Seal, and frankly, they don't even convince me. There's got to be a better reason. Then he thought for a moment, he smiled, and he said, well, think on this. It takes two to tango. I replied, "Huh?" And then he explained that when it came to the virgin birth, it just was not possible. There would have had to have been a human father. What he didn't realize was that in that one idea, he completely undermined the case not only for Christianity, but for Judaism and any other kind of theism. If God can't perform miracles, and the Bible documents say that he did perform miracles, then the documents must have been wrong. All of them. One Saturday night, I sat down to read one of the many religious pamphlets that my wife had left around the house. This particular pamphlet was titled, "What is Heaven Like?" As I began to read the hyper-literalist interpretation of heaven, I didn't read it out loud. I got part way, and in my heart I said, "No, heaven's not like that at all. Oops." The oops was because I didn't believe up until that time that such a thing as heaven even existed. And now I realized within myself that I actually had some idea of what it must be like. So I did some unpacking of my thinking. I discovered that faith was in there. I really did believe in heaven. I believed in the Bible. I believed in Christ, and was ready to say so. When I first heard the gospel, I didn't want to know that it was true, because it would have meant that my family would disown me, my friends would desert me, and that if I let myself believe in Jesus, I would have been an outcast. What I didn't realize was that I had no choice in the matter. Because if I said that Jesus wasn't the promised Messiah or the Bible wasn't true, I would know that I was being a liar. Since that time, God has answered prayer in my life over and over again. He's reassured me of his presence in my life and the lives of others in this world. But then that's another story. Moishe Rosen, founder of Jews for Jesus, is credited with having put the fact that Jews can believe in Jesus on the radar of the Jewish community worldwide.
Thank you for listening to Shoutout. For more, visit jewsforjesus.org/shoutout.